The Last of Us was a boundary-pushing title. Naughty Dog's action-adventure classic expanded the limits of interactive technology, with stunning graphics and animation. Novel visual techniques like capsule shadows and real-time bound sliding, alongside a ruthless attention to detail, produced one of the most technically accomplished games in its time, even though it debuted on aging PS3 hardware. But all that ambition came at a cost. The Last of Us often failed to reach its 30 FPS target, frequently dipping into the mid-20s in combat and traversal sequences. Even with Naughty Dog's superb PS3 engine at hand, and the team's mastery of the complex cell processor, performance was quite shaky. Enter The Last of Us Part 1. Some 9.5 years after its original release, The Last of Us has been fully remade with modern technology on PS5 hardware. With an advanced suite of graphics tech in tow, does the remake also blow past its frame time budgets? Or has Naughty Dog a more sensibly balanced visual beauty with fluid frame rates? The Last of Us Part 1 presents players with a daunting variety of visual toggles and modes. On first blush, it seems as if there are a whopping 7 visual modes, engaged through various selections and system-level tweaks. With the PS5 set to 60Hz output, you get the option of a Fidelity mode that offers 4K visuals with a 30 FPS target frame rate, alongside a performance mode that advertises dynamic 4K visuals or native 1440p visuals depending on your console's output resolution. But with the 120Hz toggle engaged, you get the same options, though the Fidelity mode now promises a 40 FPS frame rate target. As an additional modifier, engaging both 120Hz and VRR gives you the option to unlock the 120Hz options, maximizing frame rate and using VRR to smooth out any inconsistencies. So let's unravel these options, starting with the performance mode set to 4K output. Thankfully, the results here are very straightforward, with one peculiar wrinkle that we'll talk about soon. Essentially, this performance mode offers a very convincing 60 FPS update. If you've played The Last of Us Part 2 on PS5, you'll have a very good idea of what to expect. A smooth and stable 60 FPS, even in intense scenes. I beat the entire game playing on the performance mode with my console set to 4K 60Hz output without VRR, and I noticed just a handful of frame rate issues throughout my entire playthrough. This early encounter in the streets of Boston, for instance, caused a repeatable, momentary drop to the upper 50s. I also noticed brief clutches of dropped frames during 2 moments in combat, both during the sewer section of the game and a small performance dip while opening this barricaded door. The most serious performance problem I encountered was in the final hallway in the service area encounter about a third of the way into the game. This was the only area where I could consistently hammer performance, hitting frame rates as low as 50 FPS with extended periods in the mid-50s. The combination of thick alpha effects and combat with multiple enemies proves quite demanding here. But outside of those moments, the entire game was basically locked to 60 FPS, regardless of the intensity of the gameplay. Over a roughly 12-hour playthrough on hard difficulty, I can pull out just 5 significant frame rate drops in gameplay, and only the issues in the service area hallway were intrusive while actually playing. The game's cutscenes do, however, drop 1 frame in advance of camera cuts, presumably so the engine can generate a spare frame to use for TAA. I didn't actually notice any load-related dips in cutscenes, just that 1 dropped frame whenever the camera switched angles. This is difficult to notice in my experience in the performance mode, however. So what about the performance mode at 1440p output then? Well, frame rates in my testing seemed identical regardless of whether my PS5 console was set to 1440p output or 4K output. Challenging sequences run equally well regardless of console output resolution. So what's going on? Comparing the 2 performance options side by side, image quality seems identical, even in undemanding scenes. A bit of pixel counting reveals that regardless of console output resolution, both appear to render at a fixed 1440p. You're getting 1440p no matter the console settings you use. There really isn't any dynamic 4K performance option after all. So that brings us down to a more manageable 5 graphical modes. Let's address the last of the conventional modes next, the Fidelity mode at 60Hz output. This mode advertises a 4K 30fps setup, halving the framerate in exchange for more than doubling pixel count relative to the performance mode. Fluidity takes an obvious hit, as expected, with palpably laggier controls and choppier animation owing to the reduced framerate target. But the framerate drops less often here than in the performance mode. It's essentially a straight 30fps all the way through, with just a few small caveats. The FPS dips during gameplay do return. In my hours of testing this mode, I could only spot one trouble spot, however, the hallway in the hotel service area. Here, framerates go as low as 26 FPS during a rather ill-advised close engagement with a bloater. Elsewhere, gameplay framerates seem very consistent, with the exception oddly enough of some 16 millisecond spikes on occasion. Essentially, the game delivers a smattering of closely spaced frames every so often, a small issue with the 30fps cap. It does present as a small inconsistency, but it's pretty rare and I suspect most players won't notice. Cinematics still exhibit the dropped frame on camera cuts, of course. This is slightly distracting given the lower framerate target, but I did get used to it. It just gives the impression of a small stutter immediately before a camera angle change. While the full fat 4K image is appreciated and does look very clean, the loss of fluidity relative to the performance mode is a little bit painful, but what if there was an option that split the difference between these two modes? On paper, that's exactly what the 40fps fidelity mode is supposed to offer. Impressively, the 4K resolution is retained here, alongside a boosted framerate. Engage 120Hz output in the PS5 settings menu, and the 30fps fidelity option is replaced with this 40fps mode. Though 40fps may not sound especially smooth, it targets a frame time perfectly in between the frame time targets for 30fps and 60fps, and feels like a solid middle ground between the two. We've seen 40fps modes work to great effect in titles like Ratchet & Clank, Rift Apart, and Horizon Forbidden West. Unfortunately for us, it's not that simple in this game. It turns out that The Last of Us Part 1 really doesn't have much performance to spare at 4K 30fps at all, so 4K at 40fps is a bit much to ask. Combat generally runs between 30fps and 40fps or so. Any number of actions, like aiming down the sights, hitting an enemy with a punch or a melee weapon, or actually firing a gun, are liable to bring framerates to the low to mid 30s, even in less demanding environments. At worst, sub 30fps is a distinct possibility, just like in the 4K 30fps fidelity mode. Many of the game's environments don't run at 40fps even when the player is doing nothing to provoke a framerate issue. Cutscenes run particularly poorly. The momentary stutter on camera cuts remains, but those are now paired with what essentially feels like an unlocked framerate that tends to hang around 35fps or so, with trips up and down the frame time ladder. Certain shots can see the game linger around 30fps for long periods. I appreciate the option here, but The Last of Us Part 1 doesn't seem to have the framerate overhead to actually hit 4K at a stable 40 frames per second. Dynamic resolution by all indications isn't present either, so the title can't open up performance headway as needed in intense scenes. On the plus side, however, the frame time fluctuations when running at 120Hz aren't as noticeable as when running at 60Hz, and the game spends long sections swapping between 25 millisecond frames and 33 millisecond frames, which sometimes is not especially apparent by eye. The final run of modes may be of some help here, however. These modes are available with the unlocked framerate toggle pushed when you have both 120Hz and VRR enabled in the PS5's console settings. Like similar options in recent Insomniac titles and Horizon Forbidden West, the unlocked toggle gives us the ability to run The Last of Us Part 1 without a framerate cap, leaning on a variable refresh to smooth out frame delivery. Enabling this toggle while using the performance mode provides a nice increase to smoothness. We need to use off-screen footage for this unfortunately for technical reasons, but the displayed framerate on the Samsung Q70A television does seem accurate, and the framerate drops below 60fps do correspond with what we've measured with V-synced captures. Generally speaking, the unlocked performance mode offers framerates between 60 and 100 FPS. often settling in the 70 to 80 FPS range. The trade-off here with the regular performance mode is essentially slightly less consistent input response and animation in exchange for a higher general frame rate level. Plus, any dips beneath 60 FPS are smoothed out nicely and are essentially imperceptible, though these were rare of course even when you ran the game with full VSync. It's a nice boost, though it's only really worth it in my view if you have a television that presents VRR without significant trade-offs. Many sets disable certain image quality enhancements, like local dimming, with VRR modes like this enabled. But if you do have a panel that can take full advantage, I feel like this is preferable to the default performance mode, with a substantial, although not huge, bit of extra fluidity squeezed out of the PS5 hardware. But I can recommend the unlocked Fidelity mode much more wholeheartedly relative to its V-synced counterpart. The near constant performance fumbles present in the default Fidelity mode have been smoothed out here. We're mostly in 30 to 45 FPS territory, but VRR keeps frame time jitters in check. Unfortunately, the developer implemented VRR modes with low framerate compensation on PS5 produce a smattering of 120 FPS readings alongside low framerate adjusted doubled frame rates, so this may be a little bit tough to follow on screen. If I stop the footage here though, you can get a sense of the general performance level, which is usually in 30 to 35 FPS territory during reasonably demanding content, just like with the V-synced 40 FPS Fidelity mode. The framerate inconsistency is much more obvious to me here than in the unlocked performance mode, but I'd still consider this clearly preferable to either of the V-synced Fidelity options. There's also the option of enabling VRR on the system level and leaving the unlocked framerate toggle off in the game settings. This works essentially as expected. The performance mode runs at a straight 60 FPS with any momentary dips beneath smoothed out, and is a reasonable option if you prefer an ultra-consistent presentation. Fidelity mode with VRR seems to work in the same fashion, but with low framerate compensation enabled, so just like the unlocked Fidelity mode, but with a cap at 40 frames per second, and it ends up feeling very similar to that mode overall. As a final note on performance, I thought I would do a quick comparison with prior versions of The Last of Us, starting with the flawed PS3 release. The remake has hugely improved performance relative to this earlier version. Even in demanding combat sections, the new release manages to stick firmly to its 30 FPS and 60 FPS performance targets in almost every example, without the 20 to 25 FPS lows observed on the PS3. It's a solid showing, but given the graphics technology, which does appear to be broadly in line with the PS4 exclusive Last of Us Part 2, it isn't a particular surprise. Still, the remake pushes beautiful visuals while offering consistent performance, as long as you avoid the V-synced 40 FPS Fidelity mode, which is quite flawed. Measuring The Last of Us Part 1 against 2014's PS4 port of The Last of Us, which was dubbed The Last of Us Remastered, gives slightly less compelling results. If you run the game on PS5 hardware, The Last of Us Remastered delivers a perfect 1800p 60 by default, with a 4K 30fps option as well. The graphics are much more primitive, and you can't unlock any VRR-driven framerate boosts, but it does deliver a similar level of performance and fluidity on the whole. So the final verdict. Of the 5 actual graphics modes on tap, I'd only advise against one, the 120Hz 40fps Fidelity mode without the unlocked toggle enabled. The other modes offer varying degrees of fluidity and consistency, but they all have their own reasonable merits and trade-offs. My personal preference is for the performance modes, as I didn't find that the boost to 4K made enough of a visual impact at typical viewing distances to justify compromised frame rates. I'm particularly fond of the unlocked performance option and its VRR-fueled smoothness. For deeper technical and gameplay coverage of the game itself, I'd recommend checking out John's excellent analysis video, which covers the various enhancements and changes in great detail. As a fan of the original TLU game myself, I came away mostly pleased with this effort on the whole. I would have appreciated a greater gameplay mix-up, however, as this feels strikingly similar to the original title. Enemy placements, encounter designs, and mechanics are all very similar. But big presentational improvements, including hugely boosted graphics and animation, alongside more realistic AI routines and subtle tweaks elsewhere, render this a worthy remake effort. That largely extends to performance as well, though the 40 FPS mode could use tweaks to ensure a more stable output. As it stands, The Last of Us Part 1 has consistent and solid performance across a healthy variety of visual options, and is hugely improved over its PS3 predecessor. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.